So, the first thing that comes along in this whole lesson for how we're going to be happier is the introduction of you to your brain. I really want you to be thinking about the organ that's doing all the thinking. One of the weird things about the brain is we can only know about it what it reveals to us. So, let's delve in a little bit deeper here and see the ways that our biology and our social construction don't always match. The first thing I want to address is the mind body problem. This is the phenomenon that psychologists have wrestled with for the last century or so. The idea that is our mind separate from our brain? Does our mind somehow exist differently than our biology? Now, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I feel like the best way to address this as a psychologist is to say, yes, there's a division here. And the reason I say that is because it's useful. It's a useful way of framing our situation to separate these two things. Because I think that you, like me, are used to saying, this is my brain, this is my body, these are my hands, not this is me, this is me, this is me. So it's going to help our thinking and our language to just keep these two things separate throughout the duration of this course. Now, our brain has grown up in different stages. It didn't just come all at once. It is not just one thing, but it's actually a different number of things that evolved over millions of years. So, this can actually create a lot of problems because the ways in which our brain grow up does not adapt us to the life that we live in now. Taking a look at the old brain, for example, this is what we call sometimes the lizard brain. It's the brainstem, it's the oldest part of our brain, and it's the part that reacts to things that are in the outside world, even if we don't want to react to it. So, for example, if a spider gets on you, I don't know anybody who's really okay with that, unless they have a pet tarantula, but they're weird. Generally, we're scared of spiders, but that's not a useful trait anymore. We shouldn't be scared of them. You're not going to die of a spider bite. It's statistically insignificant. It just won't happen. And yet, our brains tell us otherwise. And that's because back when this part of the brain evolved, that was really important. Our ancestors were people who were anxious. They were people who were startled by the movements in the bushes. They were people who were scared of spiders and snakes, and we still have that handed down to us. So this part of our brain gets in the way a lot. It's something that makes us very anxious, that's hard to calm down, that communicates with our nervous system to draw up blood into parts of our body that are used for fight or flight. And that moves us away from the higher functioning parts of our brain. So, this maladaptation of our brain just goes to show that we are not ready for the world that we live in. Now, it's probably even more extreme than you're assuming when I say that. The amount of change that human life has gone under in the last 200 years is more extreme than all of the change in the last 200,000 years. And that's not an exaggeration. The movements from agrarian to industrialization to an information age have been massive. Evolution doesn't keep up with it. So we live in a world where our fight or flight syndrome can be triggered by our boss calling us into the office, by a deadline coming up for a class. These things aren't frightening, but your body doesn't know that. Your body thinks you're being chased by a tiger, but really you just have to write a research paper. So taking control of this maladaptation starts with really understanding it. Okay, another way that our brains are really not situated for the world is called the rule of 150. This is a rule that anthropologists identified that based on the size of our neocortex and in relative to the size of neocortex of other mammals, it appears that we are adapted to really understand relationships of up to 150 people. That means that we grew up our brain evolved through systems where we would be in groups of about that number, and that our normal social systems would be about that size. But if you're anything like me, you don't live in a world with just 150 people. This is why we need research. If we are going to live in systems that are larger than 150 people, which we all do when we think about rules, when we think about policies, when we think about ways that we're going to be treated, the ways that we're going to be uh, part of this system, this is where research really comes into play. You have to be able to access, analyze, and use information. The information is out there. It's more accessible than it's ever been. The number one priority of our school system really should be teaching people how to access, analyze, and use this outside information, how to deploy information. But that's not what we've been doing. Instead, we've been trying to drill in this notion of memorizing information, of memorizing what's important, and that isn't the way that we should have been going. So it's now that we have to start recognizing that research and accessing these outside information banks is going to be important to us because we are part of a much bigger system than we realize. So this can get us into all sorts of like messes and situations with friends, with acquaintances, with strangers on Twitter, because we don't understand that the position that we are dealing with is very different than the position that the world deals with. So recognizing our individuality goes beyond our own brains, our own minds. We have to recognize that we're part of these bigger systems, bigger than we can understand. You have to hack into yourself to get that through. So there are all sorts of reasons that your brain is not working for you. There are reasons that your reasoning is not your own. This may seem really weird, so let's look into it. I don't know a single psychology professor who doesn't nerd out about the split brain experiments. This was a treatment for severe epilepsy that was discovered to be extremely effective back in the 60s, where they actually split the two lobes of the brain, the two hemispheres, into different parts. And what they found was that this essentially created two different brains that would act independently, but only one of them really has access to the body, to the speaking language center, while the other side can still be communicated to. What we found from these experiments is that you rationalize your decisions instantly, that you're always rationalizing what you do, what you choose, how you see things. So for example, they were able to communicate to one side of the brain, hey, pick up the keys when you're given a choice. Then the other side of the brain picks up the keys. And when they ask it, why did you pick up the keys? The guy would say, well, I was thinking about my grandmother's house and these keys reminded me of her home. But that wasn't what you were doing. You were actually being told to do this. But you come up with a reason instantly. We have to recognize that a lot of the times that we think we're using reasoning, we're really making sense out of a decision that came along pre-cognitively, that came along before we grasped the fact that we were trying to make a decision. When this teams up with cognitive dissonance, things can get wild. Basically, cognitive dissonance is our brain's instinct to try and move us away from regretting decisions. That if we make a bad decision, we're more likely to rationalize this bad decision by doubling down and making more decisions based on that bad decision. When you put these two ideas together, the fact that we rationalize everything and the fact that we want to make sense out of bad decisions, we have to recognize that a lot of what we choose to do is not really something that we chose. The reason to do this is to start recognizing that we can let go of a lot of this. We can let go not of the responsibility of our choices, but of the gravity of them. And we can start to try and recognize the ways that we behave as being beyond those types of reasons. So, in order to really hack into yourself, to hack into the parts of you that are holding you back from being happy, the reason that the Buddha said that life is suffering is because there's conflict. These different modules in your head and the social constructions around you, they're not all on the same page. That conflict is always there. So what we need to be able to do is to recognize these modules and find some ways to calm them down and to get them to start agreeing and to start living in a way that agrees with our full self rather than just appealing to different modules inside our heads. That's where we're going to be going next.